The sting of her grip still burns on my skin as I stand frozen, her words cutting deeper than I expected. Still, I don't let the fear show. My eyes remain locked on hers, steady. As the tension fills the room, her breath sharp with anger, I can't help but think of the years I've let her control me. While she seethes, I realize I've been silent for too long. That's when I make my decision. I walk away, knowing some battles can only be won in silence, and some doors can never be opened again. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The long oak dining table gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier, its polished surface reflecting the flickering of candles in crystal holders. The smell of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes filled the room, wrapping everything in a veneer of old-fashioned warmth. It was Sunday, and Tamara had invited the family over for dinner. Elaine sat at the head of the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes moved slowly over the dishes, her gaze lingering on the gravy boat. She had been quiet all afternoon, as usual, content to watch from the edges of the conversation. But there, amidst the idle chatter, she noticed the gravy was a little thick. The texture, she thought, could use just a bit of thinning. Nothing drastic, just a quiet adjustment to bring it back to its familiar richness. "Tamara," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Maybe just a touch more broth in the gravy? It feels a little heavy." The words barely left her mouth before the temperature in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, just a tightening in Tamara's jaw, the way her fingers curled against her napkin. But then, without warning, Tamara's face darkened, her lips thinning in a hard line. She slammed her hand down on the table, making the silverware rattle. "What did you say?" Tamara's voice was sharp, too loud for the space they occupied. Elaine blinked, surprised at the venom in her daughter's tone. She was used to Tamara's sharpness, but this was different. This was something more raw, more dangerous. Still, Elaine kept her calm. "Just a suggestion," she replied, trying to keep her voice as gentle as it had been before. "I only meant to help." But Tamara wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes burned with something darker than irritation, something cruel. The room went quiet, save for the soft rustling of linen napkins being adjusted. Elaine saw it then, the tension that had been building beneath the surface of all their interactions. It wasn't the first time Tamara had dismissed her, but this was something else. Tamara stood, her chair scraping back violently, and the air in the room seemed to compress, heavy with something both unspoken and deeply felt. Without warning, she reached across the table and grabbed Elaine's face, firm, possessive, forcing her to look into her daughter's eyes. "Speak again, and I will slap you," Tamara hissed, her voice low, seething. The words cut through Elaine like a blade, but she held her ground. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to flinch. Not here, not now. The room held its breath. Brandon, seated beside Tamara, said nothing. His gaze dropped to his plate, eyes unfocused, as though this was all happening in a distant world he wasn't a part of. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, a void that threatened to swallow everything. Elaine froze. For a moment, she thought she might speak, say something, anything to calm the storm brewing in front of her. But she could feel it now, deep in her bones. This wasn't about the gravy. It wasn't about her suggestion. It was about something far more fundamental, a control that had always been there, hidden under layers of polite words and empty gestures. Slowly, she stood up, her back straight, her face composed. "Then I will speak somewhere else," she said, her voice unwavering despite the thundering in her chest. She turned to leave the room, her steps deliberate, as if each movement was an act of defiance against the weight of years spent swallowing her voice. The soft click of her heels echoed through the space, And then she was out of the room. Carolyn, who had been quietly watching from the sidelines, was at her side in an instant. Her presence, calm and steady, was a reminder that Elaine wasn't alone in this. The two of them walked through the kitchen, not a word passing between them, until they were out the back door and into the cool evening air. Carolyn's hand on her arm was a silent comfort, and Elaine found herself grateful for her quiet strength. They didn't speak, but the connection between them, forged over decades of friendship, was enough. They stood together on the porch for a long moment, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind in the trees. Then, Elaine's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, seeing Mara's name. The message was simple, and yet it stung in a way that made her heart ache. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know she'd snap like that." Elaine's fingers hovered over the screen, her heart a mix of sorrow and anger. She wasn't sure what to feel anymore, betrayal or exhaustion. It didn't matter, because the truth had never been clearer. She was done pretending, done making excuses. The silence of the moment was broken by the sound of a car pulling away from the driveway. Tamara's car, disappearing down the road. Elaine didn't look back. The past had just slammed its door shut. And Elaine, for the first time in years, felt free. But the question still lingered in the back of her mind, sharp and insistent. What was she going to do now? And the answer was clear. She would fight. She would speak. And she would never be silenced again. The morning after the dinner was quiet, eerily so. The house, once full of the noise of family gatherings and feigned civility, now felt too still. Elaine moved through the rooms with careful steps, as if the very air held its breath, awaiting her next decision. The last 24 hours had shifted something deep inside her, something that couldn't be undone. She wasn't sure how long she'd been sitting at the kitchen table when the phone call came through. The voice on the other end was familiar, calm and grounded. Gerald Knox, her longtime estate attorney, the one person who had always been able to keep her life and affairs in order when everything else felt like it was falling apart. "I'll be at the office in an hour," he said, his tone steady as ever. "I'll have the coffee on." Elaine didn't respond immediately. Instead, she set the phone down and stared out the window at the sprawling yard. The grass was wet with dew, the world outside still quiet. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. The family legacy, the one Tamara had assumed was hers by right, suddenly felt like an anchor instead of a gift. She had spent decades building it, her home, her name, her life's work. But it had all been taken, piece by piece, until it wasn't even hers anymore. The property, the inheritance, the quiet dignity she had once held. Tamara had taken it all. And now, for the first time in a long time, Elaine was ready to take it back. Gerald's office was just as she remembered. Dark wood panels lining the walls, a rich, comforting scent of leather and aged paper in the air. He stood behind his desk, a tall, composed figure with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. As Elaine entered, he gestured for her to sit. "Good morning, Elaine," he said, his voice steady, his gaze calm but inquisitive. "How are you holding up?" Elaine took a seat across from him, feeling the weight of her decision settle deeper within her. For the first time, it wasn't just about Tamara. It was about her own life, her own future, the legacy she had been quietly letting slip away. "I'm ready," she said, the words coming out with surprising strength. She could feel the fire beginning to burn inside her again, a steady, quiet flame that hadn't been there in years. Gerald didn't ask her to explain. He simply nodded and opened a folder, pulling out the current will. The heavy paper felt cold under Elaine's fingers when he slid it toward her. The will was straightforward. Everything was to be left to Tamara. All of it. The house, the money, the heirlooms, the land. Everything. Elaine's eyes traced the signature at the bottom of the document. It was her name, but it didn't feel like her will anymore. "Do you want to amend this or completely erase it?" Gerald asked, his voice low but sharp with understanding. Elaine didn't hesitate. She met his gaze, steady and unyielding. "Burn and rebuild," she said, her voice low but filled with purpose. Gerald's lips twitched into the faintest smile, a knowing look in his eyes. He knew what this meant. He had been her confidant for years, trusted with every secret, every sorrow, every small triumph. He was more than a lawyer. He was a silent witness to her life. "Understood," he said quietly, his pen poised over a fresh sheet of paper. "I'll begin drafting a new plan. We'll make sure it's airtight." Back at the house, Elaine found herself sitting at the kitchen table again, staring at her phone. Tamara's name flashed on the screen, an unsent message blinking in her inbox. She stared at the words that had appeared earlier that morning, each one carrying its own weight. "So we're not speaking now?" Elaine didn't bother to respond. Instead, she let the message sit there, unread. She didn't need to explain herself to Tamara. Not anymore. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, as if considering whether she should offer some kind of closure, some token of peace. But she quickly rejected the idea. Peace had never been an option for her daughter, only control. And that was something Elaine had no intention of conceding any longer. Instead, she slipped the phone back into her pocket and stood, her eyes resting on the garden outside. Carolyn had been her friend, her anchor, her steady presence for as long as Elaine could remember. The two of them had shared everything, the good, the bad, the heartbreaking. Carolyn had been there through every stage of Elaine's life, and this was no different. She picked up the phone to call her. "Elaine," Carolyn's voice came through, calm and steady. "I was thinking about what you said last night, about Tamara. She's always assumed that your silence meant agreement, hasn't she?" Elaine nodded, even though Carolyn couldn't see her. "Yes," she whispered. "That's exactly it." Carolyn's voice softened with understanding. "She doesn't know how to deal with you now, Elaine. Not when you're not silent anymore." Elaine smiled faintly, though the gesture felt strange. She hadn't smiled in a long time, not like this. But Carolyn was right. For the first time in years, Elaine wasn't willing to play the part of the dutiful mother, the silent widow, the submissive bystander. She had lived her life quietly, letting Tamara dictate the terms of their relationship, but not anymore. As Elaine stared out at the garden, something inside her shifted, firm, solid, and unbreakable. The first step had been taken, but as she looked at the empty driveway, she wondered, what would Tamara do next? The game was changing, and Elaine knew she wasn't the only one who had to prepare for the next move. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. The house felt different now. Not just in the way it echoed in the stillness of early mornings, or the way the furniture seemed misplaced, but in the very air itself. It had been the heart of Elaine's world for decades, a sanctuary she had created and tended to with care. But now, with Tamara and Brandon moving in, uninvited, ungrateful, it had become something else entirely. It was as though the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of the tension between them, growing thicker with every passing day. Tamara had moved in last year, after Brandon's real estate business slowed. The excuse was simple enough. They needed a place to stay while they got back on their feet. But the arrangement had never been a temporary one, not in Tamara's mind. She had assumed she was entitled to the house, that it would become hers by default, by virtue of being her mother's daughter. It started with small things. The curtains Elaine had chosen replaced with ones that were more modern, more expensive. A few pieces of furniture rearranged to suit Tamara's taste, but not Elaine's. Then came the locks. Tamara had changed the locks on the front door without asking, without even mentioning it to Elaine. The first time Elaine tried to open the door and it wouldn't budge, she thought it was a mistake. Maybe the old lock had finally given out. But when she called the locksmith to have it fixed, the man on the other end of the line had asked if she was the one who had requested the change. Confused, she hadn't known what to say. Tamara had done it without so much as a word, assuming that, because the house was hers in name, it was hers in every way. Elaine stood in the hallway now, her gaze drifting over the spot where the front door once opened into the wide, welcoming foyer. The walls were a bit too bare now, the furniture a little too arranged to her daughter's liking. The house felt empty, not because it was lacking in items, but because it had been stripped of its soul, the soul Elaine had put into it. Her eyes moved to the kitchen, where the counters had been covered in plastic trays, where fresh flowers always seemed to wilt before they reached their peak. The faucet had been replaced with something too modern, too sleek. It was as though the house had stopped reflecting her, the woman who had lived here for years, and started reflecting Tamara's need for show. Elaine exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing the delicate trim of the cabinet. Every detail felt like a violation. The phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't need to look. She already knew it was Gerald, the steady voice of reason. She had asked him to come over today, and he had agreed without hesitation. "I'm here," he said when she answered, his voice soft yet firm. "Shall we go through it?" Elaine stepped toward the door and paused. "Yes," she said simply. "We'll go through it." Gerald arrived at the house a short while later, his gray suit neatly pressed, a quiet air of authority about him that Elaine had always trusted. He didn't need to ask questions. He had been through this with other clients, families battling over what was rightfully theirs, over inheritance, over control. He and Elaine went straight to the documents, sitting at the kitchen table that had once been a place of warmth. Now it felt cold, unwelcoming. Elaine glanced at the page he pushed toward her. The words stark and unforgiving. She could hear the hum of the house in the background, the things she couldn't unsee or unfeel. "You have grounds for eviction," Gerald said, tapping the paper with his pen. His eyes met hers, soft with understanding but sharp with business. Elaine nodded, her fingers curling around the pen. "I have grounds for something better," she replied quietly. The words felt like a revelation to her. She hadn't thought of it that way before, but now it was clear. It wasn't just about evicting Tamara. It was about reclaiming her own life, her own space. Elaine stood up, her hands trembling slightly as she moved toward the hallway. She had been so passive for so long, letting Tamara take whatever she wanted without so much as a word. But this was the last straw. She wasn't going to play this game anymore. As she walked through the house, her fingers brushing against the edges of framed photos on the walls, the heirlooms she had carefully chosen and placed, she felt the weight of everything that had been taken from her. The crystal vase that had once sat proudly on the mantel was now missing. A silver tray, a family treasure, had been relegated to the kitchen counter as if it were something disposable. It stung, but it also ignited something in her. Elaine walked into the master bedroom, and her gaze immediately fell to the armoire where she had stored her most cherished belongings: jewelry, fine china, and family heirlooms passed down through generations. It was all still there, untouched, but it felt different. Tamara had never once asked about any of it, as if it were simply hers by default. She opened the drawers slowly, her fingers trailing over the fabric of old, delicate lace. It was time to pack. Carolyn arrived soon after, her presence steady and familiar. The two of them didn't need to speak at first. They moved in tandem, each knowing the other's role. Carolyn took out her phone and began documenting the damages: scratches on the hardwood floor, the chipped corners of furniture, the loose cabinet doors. It was methodical, quiet, and necessary. Elaine started packing up the heirlooms, her fingers brushing the delicate edges of family memories. She carefully wrapped each item in tissue paper, placing it in a box. The action felt like a quiet act of resistance, a reclaiming of what was hers. Carolyn's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. She thought she had control, didn't she? Elaine nodded, her eyes focused on the task before her. She always has. Well, not anymore, Carolyn said, a glint of steel in her voice. Not after today. Elaine stood up and looked around one last time, her heart heavy but resolute. This house, this space, was her sanctuary, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her again. But as she glanced toward the driveway, she couldn't help but wonder. Would Tamara fight back? Would she even see this coming? The question hung in the air, unresolved. And Elaine knew that what came next would define everything. Gerald sat at his desk, the usual calmness of his office interrupted only by the soft rustling of papers and the steady tick of an old clock on the wall. The scent of aged leather and polished wood filled the air, the atmosphere one of long-standing professionalism. He had seen countless families come through this office, battles over inheritance, land, and family legacies. But none had the weight of this one. None had a daughter like Tamara. Elaine had made her choice. The will was in the works, airtight. But today was the beginning of the confrontation. The door slammed open without a knock, and there, standing in the doorway, was Tamara. Her face was flushed with fury, her steps sharp and deliberate, as if she thought she could force her way through this like she had done to everything else in her life. Behind her, Brandon shuffled in quietly, looking uncomfortable, his gaze darting to the floor as if the entire situation were too much for him to handle. "Gerald," Tamara said, her voice tight with barely controlled rage, "I demand an explanation. My mother is being manipulated." Gerald didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, unshaken by the outburst. He sat back in his chair, a professional mask slipping easily into place. "Your mother is the one who made the decisions, Tamara. Let's take a look at the deed, shall we?" He slid a thick stack of papers across the table toward her. Tamara snatched them up, flipping through the pages with increasing impatience. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her fingers trembling as they skimmed the documents. "You're telling me that she's leaving everything to me, and now suddenly, she's rewriting it all behind my back?" Her voice cracked with anger. Gerald remained calm, his tone firm but polite. "Your mother is well within her rights, Tamara. If she wishes to make amendments to her estate, that is her prerogative." Brandon shifted uneasily. His presence barely noticeable, his shoulders slumped as though the tension was too much to bear. He glanced at Elaine's name on the paperwork, looking almost apologetic, as though trying to reconcile the woman he'd married with the one he had come to know in these last few years. Elaine stepped into the office then, a slow, measured movement. She wore the pearls she had received from her mother on her wedding day. Exquisite, simple, timeless. Her poise, as always, was a silent declaration of her strength. She moved through the room with quiet confidence, her gaze steady as she approached the table. Tamara's eyes narrowed as she turned to Elaine, her anger bubbling over. "You're not doing this to me, Mom. You don't get to destroy everything because you've decided you don't want to play by the rules anymore." Elaine's voice was a soft but firm command, cutting through the noise of Tamara's hysteria. "I'm not destroying anything, Tamara. I'm taking control of what's mine. You're not being removed. You're being uninvited." The words landed like a slap. Tamara's face turned an ugly shade of red, her hands trembling as they gripped the sides of the desk. She looked at Brandon, then back at Elaine, as if trying to reconcile this woman with the one who had always silently accepted her demands. "This will ruin us," Tamara spat, her voice a mix of disbelief and pure venom. You're destroying everything we've built. You're throwing away your legacy. Elaine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. The calm she had found in the last few days was a shield now, and nothing Tamara said could pierce it. That part started when you raised your hand, Elaine said, her voice ice cold, cutting through the air like a blade. She stood straighter, her gaze unwavering, as she spoke to her daughter, the woman she had once thought would care for her in her old age. Brandon looked up, finally meeting Elaine's eyes for the first time since entering the room. There was guilt in his expression, an uncomfortable shift that didn't go unnoticed. But instead of speaking, he turned away, as if he couldn't bear to be part of this any longer. He was a man caught between his wife's fury and the quiet strength of the woman he had never fully understood. Tamara stood there, her chest heaving with anger as the silence hung thick in the room. It was the first time she had seen her mother stand up to her. Not just stand up to her, but defeat her. Gerald cleared his throat, and for a brief moment it felt like the air had shifted. Elaine has made her wishes clear, he said calmly, though his voice carried a certain weight now, an undeniable finality. The documents are being filed. There's no reversing this. Tamara's lips parted as though she might say something more, but the words never came. The realization was sinking in, slowly, painfully. For the first time, she was seeing the woman who had once been her obedient mother, the woman who had silently put up with years of her cruelty, stand in front of her as something entirely different. And in that moment, Tamara knew, this wasn't about the house, or the estate, or the inheritance. This was about something far deeper. The power had shifted. The game was no longer hers to control. Elaine gave one final, unflinching look at her daughter, and then turned, moving with the same calm determination that had brought her here. She didn't need to say more. There was nothing left to say. But as she left the office, the question that hung in the air was clear. What would Tamara do now? And Elaine didn't care anymore. She had already won. The locks on the front door clicked closed for the final time. The key turned with a satisfying, deliberate twist, sealing the house Elaine had once shared with her daughter. The house that had become a battleground, a symbol of everything she had been willing to give away for years and everything she was taking back now. It had been a quiet decision, one made with cold precision after the 72-hour notice had expired. Elaine hadn't hesitated. The papers had been filed, the sheriff had been notified, and now the doors were closed. This was no longer her home in any sense of the word. Tamara had forced her out of it, and now it was time to make the removal official. Elaine stood in the hallway, her hand resting on the door frame, staring at the empty space. There was a weight in her chest, a silent grief. But it was not for the house. It was for the daughter who had become a stranger. The woman she had once hoped would be her protector, her only child, had betrayed her in ways that cut deeper than anything a house or inheritance could. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. The sound was sharp, insistent. Elaine walked toward it slowly, pausing just before she opened it. She knew who it was. Tamara's rage had been boiling over for days, and it was now reaching its boiling point. She opened the door to find Tamara standing there, her face twisted in fury. Her hands were clenched into fists, and her body was shaking with anger. Behind her, Brandon stood awkwardly, his face a study of discomfort, eyes cast downward. Tamara's voice cracked as she screamed at Elaine. "You can't do this!" Tamara yelled, her voice shrill. "This is my home, our home. You're just throwing us out like trash. You have no right to do this." Elaine stood firm, her posture calm and unyielding. "I'm not throwing you out, Tamara. You were never invited to stay in the first place." Tamara's eyes flashed with disbelief. You can't just erase everything we've built, everything that's mine." Brandon stepped forward, his voice quiet, almost pleading. "Elaine, please, can't we just talk about this? Work something out?" Elaine's gaze shifted to him, her eyes piercing but filled with an unspoken sorrow. "We stopped doing that the moment she said she'd slap me," she replied, her voice soft but final like the closing of a door that had been left ajar for far too long. Tamara shot Brandon a furious glare, her chest heaving with frustration. But there was no one left to mediate, no one left to shield her from the consequences of her actions. Elaine stood as the calm center in the storm, watching her daughter's tantrum unfold with quiet resignation. Carolyn had arrived just moments before, slipping silently into the background like she always did, her presence a quiet strength beside Elaine. She stood a few feet away, arms folded, watching Tamara with a knowing look. Carolyn hadn't said a word since Elaine had first opened the door. She didn't need to. This was Elaine's moment. The sheriff's car pulled up at the end of the driveway, the officer stepping out slowly. Tamara's wild eyes caught the motion, and for the first time, the fire in her gaze faltered. She took a step back, as if realizing that the game was over. Her shoulders slumped in defeat, the fight draining from her. Elaine turned to face the sheriff, a quiet nod passing between them. "We have the eviction order," he said in a low, steady voice. "It's time to leave, ma'am." Tamara's face contorted, the realization dawning slowly. She took a step forward, opening her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, a soft voice interrupted. "Mama, can I still visit?" Elaine froze, her gaze shifting down to Mara, who had quietly slipped out of the car. The young girl stood at the edge of the driveway, clutching something small in her hand, a note, folded neatly. Her face was pale, a mixture of confusion and sadness in her eyes. Elaine felt the knot in her chest tighten. This was the moment that would define everything. She could see in Mara's eyes the flicker of the girl she had once adored, the child who had somehow managed to remain untouched by the venom of her mother's wrath. Elaine's breath caught, her heart aching with the weight of the question. She looked at Tamara, who was standing in the background, fists clenched, her eyes hard with anger. And then, with all the strength she had left, Elaine turned to Mara. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Anytime you want." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a grand gesture of forgiveness. It was simply the truth. Mara was not a part of the games Tamara had played. She was innocent, caught between two worlds she couldn't fully understand. But Tamara was different. She had crossed a line, and the consequences would be long-lasting. The power that had shifted in Elaine's favor would remain with her, and there was no turning back now. As the sheriff made his way up the porch steps, the house behind Elaine felt colder. It wasn't just the walls or the furnishings, it was the space, the absence of what it had once been. But there was something freeing about it too. The door was closed. The past was behind her. Now it was time for Elaine to rebuild, to reclaim what had always been hers. But as the sheriff led Tamara away, a new question lingered in the air. Would Tamara ever accept this? Or had this been the last step in a battle that had only just begun? Elaine didn't have to answer. She already knew. The office was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of papers. Gerald sat across from Tamara, his fingers drumming on the edge of the desk, watching her as she seethed. She hadn't spoken in several minutes, but her fury was palpable, filling the space between them like an electric charge. Elaine sat calmly in the chair beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the scene unfold with quiet resolve. She had been through so much, but this moment, this final confrontation, was something she had anticipated for weeks. Tamara's lips were pressed together, her breath shallow and rapid, as if she couldn't quite believe what had just transpired. The sheriff had left hours ago, and now, with the papers served and the eviction in motion, Tamara was facing the one thing she had never truly expected: a fight she couldn't win. Gerald slid the thick envelope across the desk, the weight of it symbolizing the finality of the decision. Tamara snatched it up, her fingers trembling as she tore it open, glaring at him through narrowed eyes. "You think you can just rewrite everything without any consequences?" Tamara hissed, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "This is insane. She's senile. She'll regret this, you know." Elaine felt the sting of her words but didn't react. She had heard them all before. Tamara's accusations, her belief that everything she had done was justified, had always been rooted in a sense of entitlement. But the tide had shifted. She could see it in Tamara's eyes now. Disbelief. Desperation. Gerald remained unfazed. He slid another sheet of paper across the desk, this one marked in bold letters, "Contest Clause." He spoke calmly, his voice the voice of reason that Tamara had long since stopped listening to. "If you contest this will, Tamara," Gerald said, his tone crisp and matter-of-fact, "you forfeit everything." Tamara's eyes flashed with rage as she scanned the document, her face contorting. "You're telling me that if I contest my mother's will, I lose everything?" She spat, incredulous. "You've got to be kidding me." Elaine leaned forward just slightly, her voice steady, yet firm. "I'm not your mother anymore. I'm just the woman who's had enough." Tamara slammed the paper down on the desk, her face turning crimson. "She doesn't know what she's doing," she screeched. "This is ridiculous." But Gerald was prepared. She was evaluated. Her mental state was examined thoroughly, and her cognitive evaluation passed with perfect marks. He placed the report before Tamara, watching as her hand shook violently as she read the findings. Elaine had insisted on the evaluation 24 hours before she'd filed the eviction papers, knowing that Tamara would try to manipulate the situation, claiming that her mother wasn't in the right mind to make these decisions. The report, sealed and signed by a reputable neurologist, was airtight. Tamara's face paled as she finished reading the report. Her mouth worked, but no words came out. She sat back in her chair, the fight draining from her face for a moment as the weight of the situation began to settle in. Brandon, who had been silent up until now, shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking from Tamara to Elaine, then back to the papers. His voice was quieter now, almost apologetic. "Maybe we should back off, Tamara," he said, his words unsure, as though he too had begun to understand that they were not going to win this fight. This is getting bad. We don't have much leverage left." Tamara's eyes shot daggers at him. "Don't you dare tell me what to do, Brandon," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and anger. "This is my inheritance, my future." But as her words echoed in the room, it was clear. The power had shifted, and Tamara could feel it. Carolyn, who had been standing silently in the corner, watching the entire exchange, spoke up at last. Her voice was quiet but cutting, like the edge of a well-honed knife. "You raised her," Carolyn said, her gaze turning cold as she looked at Tamara. "But you buried yourself the second you got a title." Tamara recoiled at the words, her face turning an ugly shade of red. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words were stuck, tangled in the web of her own self-righteousness. Carolyn's words had hit a nerve, and Tamara knew it. She had spent so many years treating her mother like an object to control, and now the game was over. She had no one left to turn to. For a long moment, the room was silent. The tension was thick, suffocating, as if the very air around them had frozen. Gerald watched the exchange, his gaze steady and unwavering, his mind already thinking of the next steps. He knew this wouldn't be the last time they saw Tamara. There was too much at stake, too much history between them for it to end like this. But the battle had been won, for now. Elaine didn't need to say anything. Her silence, her composure, her quiet strength, these things spoke volumes. Tamara had tried to intimidate her, to break her down, but it hadn't worked. Elaine had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her future. Finally, Tamara stood up, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. "This isn't over," she said, her voice hoarse. Elaine didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She had already won. As Tamara stormed out of the office, her fury still blazing in her eyes, Gerald turned to Elaine. His expression softened, but there was a new respect in his gaze. "We're not done yet," he said. "But for now, you've secured your future." Elaine nodded, her heart still heavy but her resolve unwavering. This was just the beginning. But the question that lingered in the air was clear. Would Tamara fight back? And if she did, what would Elaine do then? The silence that followed was deafening, and Elaine, for the first time in a long time, was ready for whatever came next. The house was quiet. It had been almost a week since Tamara's final outburst in Gerald's office, and Elaine had allowed the silence to settle around her like a blanket. The house felt different now, emptier, yet at the same time, there was a peace that had eluded her for years. Tamara was gone, her hold over the home, the inheritance, the family, slipping away, piece by piece. But there was one person left who still mattered. Mara. Elaine hadn't expected to see her. Not yet, at least. She knew that the young girl, caught between loyalty to her mother and a quiet affection for her grandmother, was stuck in an impossible position. But the knock on the door that evening wasn't what she expected. It was soft, almost hesitant, and it was followed by a familiar voice calling out from the other side. "Mama, it's me." Elaine's heart lurched. She hadn't heard Mara use that word in so long. She hadn't seen her granddaughter for months, not since the rift had deepened between Tamara and herself. Elaine opened the door, her pulse quickening. There, standing in the dim hallway light, was Mara. Her face flushed, eyes wide, her arms holding a stack of worn books close to her chest. "Mara," Elaine whispered, her voice tight, almost afraid that if she spoke too loudly, the moment would shatter. I, uh, I brought these," Mara said, looking almost embarrassed. She shifted the books awkwardly in her arms. "You know, the ones we used to read together. I thought you might want them back." Elaine's breath caught as she took the books from Mara's hands. She ran her fingers over the spines, each title bringing back memories. Memories of afternoons spent reading together, of Mara nestled in her lap, her voice light and filled with wonder. Those were the moments Elaine had cherished, the moments that had once made the pain of the world outside feel a little more bearable. Mara stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room with an air of tentative curiosity. She seemed to be looking for something. Something she wasn't sure she would find. Elaine motioned to the living room and they sat down together. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. There was so much that needed to be said, but neither of them seemed sure where to begin. "Mara," Elaine began softly, "there's something I want to show you." She stood and walked across the room to a wooden chest, one of the few pieces of furniture Tamara hadn't moved or rearranged. Elaine had kept it close to her heart for years, storing the most precious of her memories in it. She opened the lid slowly, revealing a velvet-lined interior. Elaine reached in and carefully pulled out a small, delicate jewelry box. The soft gold hue glistened in the dim light, and Mara's eyes widened. Elaine opened it, revealing two pieces of jewelry, her mother's earrings, the ones that had been passed down through generations, and her own wedding locket. Both items shimmered softly, holding within them the weight of a lifetime. "These aren't just items, Mara," Elaine said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "They're choices. And I'm choosing you." Mara's breath caught, and her fingers reached for the locket, touching it with reverence. The weight of her grandmother's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the two of them sat in silence, the bond between them reaffirmed in that simple act of trust. Mara blinked rapidly, as though fighting back tears. "I won't let her take that away," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elaine reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from Mara's face, her heart aching with both pride and sorrow. She knew what this meant. The inheritance, her life's work, had always been meant for her daughter. But now it was going to the granddaughter who had remembered her name, the daughter who had stayed quiet, even when the world had seemed to pull her in two directions. But Elaine wasn't done. She pulled a thick envelope from the chest and slid it across to Mara. It was sealed with the same authority that had defined the past few weeks. "Inside," Elaine said, "is a conditional trust. You'll receive a full inheritance, but only if you do one thing. You have to graduate and stay clean of the drama that's followed this family." Mara's eyes widened in surprise. She picked up the envelope slowly, as if afraid it might slip through her fingers. "Graduation? What do you mean?" Mara asked, her voice faltering slightly. Elaine smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "I know it's a lot. But you're smart, Mara. I believe in you. Just remember this. You're not responsible for the mess your mother created. You don't have to carry it with you." Carolyn's voice, as always, came from the quiet shadows of the room. "Smart girl, good soil, bad gardener." Mara didn't quite understand what Carolyn meant, but Elaine did. Carolyn had been right. Mara was the one who could flourish if given the chance, if she chose to rise above the mess Tamara had made. Mara held the envelope tightly, her eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and determination. "I'll do it. I'll make you proud, Grandma. I won't let her ruin what you've built." Elaine nodded, the corner of her mouth twitching into a faint smile. "Good," she said. "Good. I'm counting on you." But as Elaine looked at the young girl in front of her, she felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. There was still so much left unsaid, so much left to rebuild. Tamara had left scars, and Mara wasn't immune to the fallout. But Elaine had one last hope, that Mara could be the future she had longed for, the future that her daughter had stolen from her. The weight of the world seemed to shift just a little. And for the first time in years, Elaine felt that perhaps, just perhaps, the battle was finally over. The calm that had settled in the wake of Tamara's departure was short-lived. Elaine hadn't expected peace to last long, not when someone like her daughter was involved, but she hadn't been prepared for the war that came next. It started small, whispers, rumors, but it grew louder with every passing day. Tamara wasn't just angry anymore. She was dangerous. She knew how to manipulate, how to make people believe a version of events that suited her. And now, she was doing exactly that. Elaine sat at her kitchen table, the soft hum of the coffee maker in the background, as she read through the latest email from Gerald. Her eyes narrowed at the words. "Tamara is claiming elder abuse," Gerald wrote. "She's filing complaints against both Carolyn and me. She's spreading the idea that we've manipulated you, that you're being taken advantage of. It's a smear campaign, Elaine. They'll try to discredit us. We need to be ready." Elaine set the phone down with a sigh, staring at the empty kitchen, the space that had once been full of noise and life, now eerily quiet. She had expected this, had known Tamara would never go down without a fight. But this was different. This was personal. And it wasn't just about the estate anymore. It was about who controlled the narrative. It was about winning, at any cost. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Carolyn stood on the threshold, her expression tight but determined. Elaine knew what was coming before she even opened her mouth. "She's already started," Carolyn said, stepping inside, her voice low. "She's spreading lies to anyone who'll listen, claims that you've been coerced, that I've been part of it, that we're taking advantage of your mental state." Elaine clenched her fists, but her voice remained steady. I knew she'd go there. Carolyn's face softened, but there was no pity in her eyes, only the shared understanding of the battle ahead. She's using all the old tricks, Elaine, the ones that worked for years. But you know what they say about people like that? They can only lie for so long. Elaine nodded, but she didn't feel as certain as she let on. The damage had already been done, and the whispers would continue. People would start doubting her, questioning her decisions. But there was no turning back now. Gerald had been quick to act. By the time Elaine had finished reading his email, a formal harassment complaint had already been filed. It was airtight, as always. And yet, Elaine couldn't help but feel a twinge of dread. This wasn't just about paperwork anymore. This was about her life, her family. And Tamara had no intention of letting her go without a fight. "I'll handle the rest," Gerald had said, but even his calm demeanor couldn't hide the gravity of the situation. "But I want you to start gathering anything that might help us defend ourselves." So Elaine did. She spent the next few days scouring through old voicemail recordings, the ones that Tamara had left her over the years. Cruel messages, belittling her, demeaning her for everything from her decisions to her very existence. Elaine sat at the computer, her fingers shaking slightly as she played back the messages. Each one brought back memories of the daughter she had once tried so desperately to protect. The words blurred together, cutting deep. "You're pathetic. Why do you even bother? Just give up. Let me take care of everything." The voices in the messages filled her mind, but they also filled her with a cold, quiet fury. Tamara's grip on her had been so complete that Elaine had allowed herself to be drowned in those words. But not anymore. As the days wore on, things began to shift in ways that even Elaine hadn't anticipated. The battle had begun, but the unexpected part was how Tamara's actions had alienated those around her. Brandon, once so passive, so unwilling to challenge his wife, had begun to pull away. His calls to Carolyn had become more frequent, his voice strained with guilt. "I didn't sign up for this, Carolyn," he said one evening, his voice thick with exhaustion. "None of this was ever supposed to happen. I don't know how much longer I can stand by and watch her destroy everything." Carolyn's response was quiet but cutting, as always. "But you didn't stop it either. You let it happen. And now, we're all paying the price." Elaine could feel the shift in the air. It wasn't just Tamara who was losing control. It was everyone she had ever relied on. The empire she'd built with manipulation and cruelty was crumbling, piece by piece. Even Brandon, the man who had always cowered under her thumb, was beginning to break free. And then came the final, most cutting blow. Mara stopped answering her mother's texts. Elaine had been sitting in her study when the notification came in. It was a simple message from Mara, one she hadn't expected, one that made Elaine's heart skip a beat. "I'm not ready to talk to her. I'll visit soon. I promise." Elaine's hand trembled as she placed the phone down. She knew this was it. Mara had chosen her side. She had finally seen the truth. But Tamara wasn't done. Elaine could already imagine the storm Tamara would bring to Mara's door. The texts, the accusations, the manipulations. Tamara wouldn't stop until she had turned Mara against her, too. Later that week, Elaine sent Mara a package. It was small, wrapped carefully with a note tucked inside. The package contained the family photo albums, carefully preserved over the years. But Elaine had made one final change. In each photo, where Tamara once stood beside her, Elaine had quietly cut her out. Tamara's absence, subtle yet undeniable, was a stark reminder of where things had gone wrong. Elaine didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if Mara would understand, or if this would push her further away. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had nothing left to lose, except the future she had fought for. And as the package left her hands, Elaine knew one thing for certain. The battle wasn't over. But this time, she was ready for whatever came next. It wasn't a fancy coat, wool, slightly worn at the cuffs, but it fit her like a promise. The soft emerald color had always brought out the warmth in her complexion, something Gerald once pointed out in passing years ago. Today, she wore it with a calm pride she hadn't felt in ages. The Lexington Community Hall buzzed with polite chatter as locals filtered in, sipping lukewarm coffee from paper cups. Folded programs sat on every seat. A banner hung from the rafters, Annual Civic Service Recognition. Elaine had attended this event dozens of times in her life, always as a spectator, never as someone whose name was printed on the program. Carolyn waited beside her at the entrance, wearing a smile so proud it almost hurt to look at. "Ready?" she asked. Elaine nodded, smoothing the coat one last time. Ready. Inside, the applause that met her arrival wasn't thunderous, but it was warm, genuine. These were people who remembered the library programs she'd run, the literacy nights she'd organized, the books she'd driven across town to deliver during storms. They weren't clapping out of obligation. They were clapping because she had mattered. And after months of being twisted into a villain in her daughter's delusional narratives, that meant more than she could say. When the MC called her name, Carolyn squeezed her hand. Gerald stood in the back, arms crossed, proud and still, like oak. Elaine walked onto the stage slowly, but her posture didn't waver. She stepped up to the microphone, adjusted it once, and let the silence settle before she spoke. "Kindness doesn't retire," she said. The room grew quiet. Even the HVAC seemed to hush. She spoke simply, about service, about resilience, about how one life touches another in ways we rarely recognize until it's too late. She avoided mentioning Tamara, avoided bitterness, avoided the temptation to reveal just how vicious things had become. Today wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what she had always been, a woman who gave without being asked, who helped without seeking thanks. The applause when she finished rose like a soft wave, not loud but steady enough to shake her. As she stepped off the stage, Carolyn whispered, "She'd hate that speech." Elaine smiled. "Which part?" "All of it." They laughed quietly, two women who had survived too much to take praise lightly. The laughter died the moment the commotion began near the front door. "Tamara." Her voice cut through the foyer like metal scraping cement. Even before Elaine saw her, she could hear the chaos. Tamara insisting she had a right to be there, security telling her she did not. Brandon trailing behind her with an expression of exhaustion carved into his face. She pushed past the ticket table, but security caught her before she could step further. "I'm her daughter. Move," she barked. "No admittance," the guard repeated, one hand raised. "You're not on the guest list." "You think a list means anything?" she hissed. "That's my mother." Elaine remained still, watching from the far side of the hall. She didn't approach. She didn't flinch. She simply observed, as though watching a stranger make a scene in a grocery store aisle. And in a way, she was. Tamara's rage filled the space until security finally ushered her back outside. The doors shut, muffling her voice. Brandon lingered behind her outside, pacing the sidewalk, glancing toward the parking lot as though waiting for someone. Then Elaine saw it. His eyes fixed on a spot across the asphalt. An empty parking space. A space where Mara was supposed to be. She didn't come. Brandon's shoulders sagged, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. For the first time, he looked truly alone. He mouthed something Elaine couldn't hear. But she didn't need to. The meaning was written plainly across his face. "She's choosing her grandmother." Carolyn stepped beside Elaine. "Told you," she murmured. "Good soil." Elaine exhaled, letting the moment settle into her bones. That evening, when the ceremony ended and the guests dispersed, Elaine and Carolyn walked back to the house. The plaque, engraved with her name, shimmering with quiet dignity, rested in its box beneath Elaine's arm. Inside the foyer, Carolyn climbed a small step stool and leveled the plaque against the wall. Elaine held it steady from below. "There," Carolyn said, stepping down. "Right where it belongs." Elaine looked at it for a long moment. Her name, her service, her story, permanently displayed in the home she'd reclaimed inch by inch. "Funny how dignity fits better when no one's holding it for you," Elaine murmured. Carolyn huffed a warm little laugh. "Fits you just fine." Elaine smiled. For the first time in months, the house felt alive. But the quiet peace didn't settle for long. Because when Elaine turned toward the staircase, she saw a shadow under the front door. An envelope slid across the floor, still trembling from the force with which it had been shoved. Her name was scrawled across the front in furious handwriting. Tamara. Inside was a single sentence. "If you think this is over, you've underestimated me." Elaine stared at it, the air around her thickening again. The war wasn't over. Not even close. Elaine sat at her desk, the quiet hum of the house surrounding her as she poised her pen over the final draft of the trust. The words came slowly, deliberately. Each sentence felt like an act of defiance, a reaffirmation of everything she had fought for. It had taken time, months of legal battles, of fighting off every accusation Tamara had thrown at her. But Elaine had won. And now, she was going to make sure the world knew it. She read the letter one last time, the words clear and unflinching. "Legacy is not automatic. It's earned. And I'm choosing who earns it." Elaine closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the words sink in. She'd given Tamara every chance, every ounce of her love, but there was a limit. And now, the final decision was hers to make. Tamara had tried to take everything from her. Her home, her dignity, her future. But Elaine had rewritten the rules. The legacy that had been stolen would now belong to someone who deserved it. The press had caught wind of the story long ago. As much as Elaine had fought for her privacy, the truth couldn't be hidden. But she hadn't planned for what would happen next. It was one thing to fight for what was rightfully hers in the quiet halls of law offices. It was another entirely to have that story laid out for the entire world to see. The phone rang. Elaine picked it up without glancing at the screen. "Gerald," she said, her voice steady. "You didn't just win, Elaine." Gerald's voice came through, a note of admiration in his tone. "You documented it. You put your stamp on this thing." Elaine nodded to herself, though he couldn't see it. "I made sure the story was told," she said, a quiet satisfaction in her words. "This will follow her." Gerald chuckled softly, but there was a knowing quality to his laugh. "I've had calls from reporters. You're going to be on the front page of the Lexington Ledger tomorrow. Elder law heroine rewrites her family tree." Elaine felt a jolt of discomfort, but it was fleeting. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it because Tamara had left her no choice. She was doing it because her daughter had crossed the line. But still, the thought of her name plastered on a headline, the whole town knowing her business, felt like a different kind of battle. "Well, let them write it," she said finally, her voice firm. "Let them know what happens when someone decides not to be a victim anymore." The article ran the next morning, as Gerald had predicted. The headline was bold, making sure every eye in the city fell on Elaine's story. As expected, Tamara didn't take kindly to the press coverage. Her humiliation was complete when she opened her eyes to a dozen missed calls from her yoga clients. The business she had carefully crafted, the one she'd used as a tool to manipulate and control her world, began to unravel. Her phone lit up, her screen filled with text after text. "Sorry, but I'm canceling my membership. I just don't feel comfortable with what's going on. I think I'll try a new instructor." The texts piled up, each one a small victory for Elaine. Tamara's carefully constructed image was crumbling faster than she could keep up with. Elaine sat back in her chair, reading the newspaper feature again. There were no more lies to bury her under, no more claims to hide behind. What was left now was the truth, her truth, and the world was hearing it. She set the paper down and walked toward the window, looking out at the street below. It was a bright morning, the sun casting a warm glow over the quiet town. The world, it seemed, was carrying on without her. The family she had spent so many years holding together was scattered in the wind, Tamara now a distant echo of the past. And then came the voice message. Elaine's phone buzzed and she almost didn't recognize the number. When she pressed play, Mara's voice came through, shaky but strong. "I'm proud of you, Grandma," she said softly, the words trembling at first but gaining strength as she spoke. "I see now. I I don't know how I could have missed it before, but I see now. I'm proud of you. I love you." Elaine closed her eyes, letting the words sink into her heart. This was it. This was why she had fought. This was why the fight was worth it. Mara was the future. And in a world where everything had felt broken, Elaine had finally found the one thing that mattered. But even as Elaine let herself bask in the quiet relief, she knew the war wasn't truly over. Tamara was a force, and she wouldn't lie down without a fight. The future wasn't guaranteed. There would always be more battles. But now Elaine had the power to face them. She was no longer the woman who had to bend to the whims of others. She was the one who had taken back her life. As she walked back into the living room, she glanced at the picture on the mantel, a picture of her and Mara, a reminder of how far they had come. Tamara's storm was far from over, but Elaine was no longer afraid of the rain. The battle may have been won, but the war? It had only just begun. The letter came by courier, hand-delivered with quiet finality. Elaine had instructed Gerald to make sure it was precise, clear, and unwavering. She had crossed every T and dotted every I in the documents. But this letter was the final step in severing ties completely. She had given Tamara every chance, but the constant barrage of lies, manipulation, and cruelty had left no room for negotiation. It was time for the world to know where the boundaries were. Elaine unfolded the letter slowly, as if the act itself somehow validated her decision. She stared at the neatly printed words. No access, no inheritance, no appeal. She didn't have to read it twice. The message was clear. The weight of it, the absolute finality, settled into her bones. Tamara was out. Completely. No more manipulation, no more control. She couldn't help but smile. It wasn't joy. Exactly. There was still a lingering pain in her chest when she thought about her daughter, but there was a sense of relief, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the line had been drawn, and it wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Elaine was standing on her porch, watching as the workmen replaced the front gate. She had always liked the idea of an open door, of a welcoming threshold, but the last few months had shown her the danger of keeping everything open. The new gate was solid, dark wood reinforced with iron. She had insisted on a passcode system, knowing that the only people who would need access were the ones she trusted. The gate's design was elegant, yet impenetrable, just like the boundaries she had established around her life. Mara, of course, would have the code. She would be the one person who could come and go freely. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elaine found herself excited by the thought of someone visiting, someone who still saw her for what she was, someone who could see beyond the wreckage Tamara had left behind. The sound of the lock clicking into place broke her thoughts. The gate was now officially locked to the outside world, and Tamara would never cross it again. Meanwhile, Gerald had taken matters into his own hands. He had intercepted Brandon's first attempt to deliver a message to Elaine, an apology, of sorts, wrapped in an excuse. Elaine had warned him about Brandon. The man had never stood up to his wife, and now, in the aftermath, he was struggling to understand how things had gotten so out of hand. "He's still trying to play the good guy, isn't he?" Carolyn remarked as they sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee, waiting for Gerald's next update. Elaine nodded. "He's a pawn, and I don't have time to feel sorry for him." Gerald had added Brandon's name to the restraining order with ease. The rules were simple. Tamara could no longer contact Elaine directly, and neither could her accomplice. If Brandon thought he could come and go without repercussions, he was sorely mistaken. Elaine folded the letter she had just signed and handed it to Carolyn. "This will do the trick," she said. "He won't get another chance." "I think that's the first time I've seen you truly done with someone," Carolyn said, half joking, half serious. "It's impressive, Elaine." Elaine didn't smile. "Done isn't the word. I'm just making sure there are no more mistakes." Days passed, and the house began to feel like a fortress. The walls were the same. The furniture had been rearranged back to Elaine's liking, but there was something different now. An impenetrable aura of control, of self-preservation. The first few times the house felt empty. It had a hollow quality. But now, there was a new sense of purpose in every corner. Tamara was a memory, a ghost that still tried to reach through the cracks. But each failed attempt, each message intercepted, each door locked, was a nail in her coffin. As Carolyn changed the locks on Elaine's studio for extra security, they both knew it wasn't just the locks that needed replacing. It was the way Tamara had used her position to manipulate everyone around her. Elaine could feel the shift, feel the weight of the new boundaries she had drawn. It wasn't just about property or money. It was about her own life, her dignity. It was about the future. And she would fight for that. The next day, the final official letter was delivered. Tamara's name was scrawled across the front in that all-too-familiar handwriting. Elaine's fingers trembled as she opened it, not from fear, but from the sheer inevitability of what was inside. The words were familiar, but the tone was different now. The accusations of being manipulated were gone, replaced with a cold, final threat. "You think you've won, but you've only pushed me further. You'll regret this." Elaine felt a deep, painful sigh escape her lips. She folded the letter and placed it aside. There was no anger left in her, no room for hate. "She crossed a line," Elaine said quietly, the words a simple statement of fact. She looked out the window, her gaze sweeping over the now locked gates, the solid walls, the studio door secured with a fresh lock. "I drew it in stone," she added, her voice quiet but certain. The storm wasn't over. Tamara wasn't finished. But Elaine was done being anyone's victim. Now, the line had been drawn, and there was no crossing it. Elaine had never truly believed that anything could be fixed. The house, yes, but her heart? That had been a different story. The walls had witnessed so much over the years. Tamara's tantrums, the quiet sacrifice of motherhood, the weight of every lost battle. And then there was the house itself, so full of memories, of the lives once lived here and now. Now it was just a battleground of sorts, but Mara's arrival had shifted something. Perhaps it was the quiet way she had slid back into Elaine's life, or perhaps it was the fact that Mara had chosen her. Either way, something was changing in the air. Elaine hadn't hesitated when Mara asked if she could stay. She'd spent so long watching Tamara burn everything to the ground that having someone in the house again felt like a blessing, even if it made the echoes of the past a little harder to ignore. A small guest suite had been prepared for Mara, a cozy corner of the house that Elaine hadn't touched in years. It had always been waiting for someone, and now it was filled with the soft glow of new beginnings. The room was simple, A bed with an old quilt Elaine had made when she was younger, a small desk near the window where the sun filtered in just right, and a shelf stacked with books Elaine thought Mara might enjoy. The air in the room was warm, peaceful, like the house had decided to let its guard down for once. Mara had walked in that morning, her eyes wide with awe, holding her cat in one arm and a stack of sketchbooks in the other. There was an uneasiness in her movements, but that was to be expected. It was hard to trust a place that had once been full of betrayal. But as she set down her things and looked around, a smile slowly spread across her face. "This is perfect, Grandma," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Elaine smiled back, feeling a twinge of warmth in her chest. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this. Someone who actually cared. Someone who didn't look at her with resentment or anger. After a quiet lunch, Elaine found herself teaching Mara how to make her grandmother's pot pie. It was a recipe passed down from mother to daughter, a tradition that Elaine had kept alive for years, even when Tamara had stopped coming around to learn. Mara stood beside her in the kitchen, her hands awkwardly fumbling with the dough, the flour dusting her fingers as she laughed softly at her own clumsiness. Elaine watched, amused, as Mara added a little too much seasoning and tried to hide it behind a forced smile. "Don't worry about it," Elaine said, chuckling. "It'll taste fine. And besides, there's no such thing as too much flavor in this house." For the first time in ages, the house felt light. There was no tension in the air, no heavy footsteps to announce Tamara's looming presence. Instead, there was the soft sound of the oven's gentle hum and the quiet rhythm of the kitchen, a place where Elaine had always found solace. When the pie was finally in the oven, Elaine set the table, her hands moving with the ease of a woman who had done this 1,000 times. She and Mara sat down to eat, the room filled with the warm aroma of the pot pie, the soft sound of silverware clinking against porcelain. Mara smiled shyly at Elaine as they ate, and for the first time, there was peace. A deep, lasting peace that filled the spaces between the words they didn't need to speak. As the night wore on and the dishes were cleaned and put away, Elaine sat on the couch, the quiet hum of the house almost deafening in its calm. It was a feeling she had longed for, but never thought she'd find again. She looked at Mara, who was curled up in the armchair, flipping through one of the sketchbooks she had brought with her. The soft scratch of the pencil on paper was the only sound in the room, and Elaine allowed herself a rare moment of gratitude. Carolyn called later that evening, her voice lighter than usual. "How's the house feeling now?" she asked. "Different," Elaine replied, her voice quiet but steady. "Like it's not just a place to live anymore. It's home again." Carolyn chuckled softly. "Smart girl. Good soil. Bad gardener," she said, her words gentle with affection. Elaine smiled at the phone, feeling a lump form in her throat. It wasn't the first time Carolyn had compared Mara to Tamara, but this time it didn't sting. It was true. The child had always been capable of growing into something good, something strong, if she was nurtured. Mara finished her sketches and stretched, then stood up to go to her room. "I'll be in the morning," she said, giving Elaine a brief but genuine smile. Elaine watched her granddaughter disappear down the hallway, and for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Later that night, Elaine updated her emergency contact. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed in Mara's name. The change was simple but meaningful. Tamara no longer had a place in this part of Elaine's life. When she hit save, it felt like a final step. She was no longer bound to the chaos of her past. Tamara was gone from the daily fabric of her world. Elaine had found a new anchor in Mara. She closed her eyes, letting the weight of it settle into her chest. "No more mistakes," she thought. "This is what I've been waiting for." But the question still lingered. Was it truly over? Or was this only the calm before the storm? Elaine was in the garden when she saw the familiar car pull up the driveway, the weathered green sedan that had been a fixture in her life for too many years. The one she had seen parked in front of the house 1,000 times, but never with the same dread that she felt now. Tamara's car. Elaine didn't look up as Tamara approached, her footsteps hesitant at first, then more confident as she closed the distance. She could hear the faint scrape of Tamara's heels on the gravel path. The wind was quiet today, the kind of stillness that made every sound seem louder. The moment Tamara reached the gate, she stopped. "Mom," she said softly, her voice hoarse, as if she had been crying. Elaine didn't respond. She stayed in the garden, her back to Tamara, tending to the flowers that had started to bloom despite everything. The quiet hum of the world around her, the birds, the soft rustling of leaves, was all the answer she needed. "I wasn't myself that day," Tamara said, her voice trembling. "Please, Mom. I wasn't myself. I—" She paused, choking back a sob. "I regret what I said. All of it." Elaine took a slow breath, her hands still moving through the soil, feeling the earth press between her fingers. She had heard this before, so many times over the years. Regret. A word that meant nothing in the face of years of actions that spoke louder than any apology ever could. Without turning, Elaine spoke in a quiet, steady voice. "Then don't ask me to trust whoever that was." There was a silence, a gap that Tamara seemed to be struggling to fill. The breeze picked up, swirling the scent of fresh blooms in the air, mingling with the tension that hung between them. Elaine could feel it, the pressure of Tamara's presence behind her, the woman who had torn so much apart, and now stood, hoping for redemption. "I can change, Mom," Tamara said, her voice softer now, a hint of pleading that made Elaine's skin crawl. "I'll go to therapy. We can work through this together. We can fix it. Just let me in." Elaine's grip on the spade tightened, her fingers aching from the effort to keep herself composed. She was tired of the words, the promises that never held weight. Tamara's manipulation had always been coated in sweetness, her words designed to trap. She had tried it all. The tears, the guilt, the attempts at control. She had used them all, and Elaine had let her. But not anymore. Elaine finally straightened, turning her head slowly, eyes narrowing as she fixed her gaze on Tamara. "That's between you and your mirror," she said, her voice as cold as the wind had become. "I don't need to be a part of that, not anymore." Tamara flinched at the words, her mouth opening as though to say something more, but Elaine didn't wait for her. She turned back to the flowers, feeling a sharp sense of finality. For the first time in years, the weight of Tamara's presence didn't crush her. Instead, Elaine felt something else, something lighter, something that had been missing from her life for so long: freedom. Tamara stood there for a moment, silent. Then she spoke, almost too quietly for Elaine to hear. "I can't fix it, can I?" Elaine didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The next morning, the phone call came. It was from Gerald, and the tone of his voice told Elaine everything she needed to know. "Brandon's filed for legal separation," he said, his voice soft but steady. "It's done, Elaine. He's done." Elaine closed her eyes, a deep exhale escaping her lips. She had expected it. She had seen it coming the moment she had watched Brandon sit in the back, quiet and passive, as Tamara tore at the fabric of their family. Now, he was making his move. She had always known that Brandon would never truly leave Tamara until it was far too late. And now, it was. Now, he had no choice but to acknowledge the wreckage she had caused. Elaine felt a quiet, bitter satisfaction settle in her chest. The end of Tamara's reign had started, piece by piece, and Brandon's actions were just another sign that the walls were finally closing in on her. Carolyn called later that afternoon, her voice calm but cutting as always. "Shame isn't healing, Elaine," she said, a slight edge to her tone. "It's exposure." Elaine nodded, even though Carolyn couldn't see her. "I know," she replied, the words feeling hollow. "I'm done with the shame. Done with the lies." Elaine placed the phone down on the counter and stood still for a long moment, staring out the window. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting the garden in soft light. Everything around her seemed calm now, but there was something deeper. Something that couldn't be erased, no matter how much she tried to move on. Elaine walked back to the garden, the finality of the past few days weighing on her. She had made her choice. Tamara had crossed a line, but now it was time for Elaine to choose what she wanted next. As she knelt down in front of the flowers, her hands brushing the petals, she spoke softly to herself, as if finally acknowledging the truth she had avoided for years. "I will not forget, but I am done responding." The storm was over, and she was finally free to rebuild. The day the letter was published, the sun hung low over Lexington, casting long shadows down the streets. Elaine stood by her kitchen window, staring out at the familiar view, her fingers still tingling from the weight of the decision she'd made. The ink had dried on the letter, her words forever etched in time. She had chosen to speak, to leave behind a legacy not of silence, but of reclamation. On Boundaries and Bloodlines. It was the title she had chosen for her piece, the one that would run in the Lexington Gazette that morning. It would be a quiet declaration, a letter to the world, to Tamara, to anyone who had ever assumed that the story of her life was one they could control. Elaine's hand shook slightly as she poured herself a cup of tea. She wasn't nervous exactly, but there was something about seeing her own words laid bare for everyone to read, to judge. She had lived a lifetime of accepting what others imposed on her, of taking on the burden of guilt and expectation. This letter was the moment she'd fought for, the culmination of years of decisions and mistakes. She glanced down at the letter one last time, reading over the words she had carefully written. The journey from silence to strength had been long, and this letter would tell the world why she had fought for herself, why she had drawn the line. It was simple, unadorned. Legacy is not automatic. It's earned. Boundaries are not barriers to love. They are its foundation. And when you have given and given, only to be silenced, disrespected, or dismissed, you must reclaim what's yours, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. This is my reclamation. This is my legacy. Elaine set the paper down and let her fingers linger on the edge of the letter. The weight of the years, of all the silent battles she had fought, pressed in on her chest. She had finally broken free. Later that week, the letter appeared. The article spread across the pages of the Gazette, with the headline standing out like a beacon. On Boundaries and Bloodlines, a local woman rewrites her legacy. It wasn't a plea for sympathy or a detailed history of her struggles. It was the truth, plain and unapologetic. Readers responded swiftly, sending flowers to her home, each bouquet a small token of respect from strangers who understood. The flowers piled up on her porch, and thank you notes poured into her mailbox. They weren't just thank yous for the letter itself. They were acknowledgments of her courage, of her willingness to speak a truth that others had long buried. Elaine had not expected such an outpouring. She had expected perhaps a quiet acknowledgement, but not this. A wave of recognition from people who didn't know her, but had lived through their own quiet battles, their own quiet sacrifices. The truth had rippled through the town, and in its wake, she was no longer the woman who had been hidden behind the walls of silence. She was something more now. She was a voice. Across town, in the dim light of a small coffee shop, Mara sat with her phone in her hands, looking down at the screen. Her voice was shaking slightly, but she steadied herself, knowing this moment was hers. She clicked record, and the soft hum of the cafe filled the silence as she began to read aloud from the letter. "My grandmother wrote this letter," she began, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "And I'm proud of her. I'm proud of her because she chose to speak, to fight. For so long she stayed silent, thinking that was the only way to love, but she learned, and she taught me that love, real love, doesn't come from silence. It comes from standing up for what's right, for yourself, even when the world tells you not to." She paused, her eyes closed as if she could still feel the weight of her grandmother's words. She had heard the letter read aloud before, of course, in private moments, but reading it to others, to strangers, felt different, felt right. When Mara finished, she posted the recording on her podcast, a small channel she had started to document her own journey with her family. The response was immediate. The podcast went viral, drawing in listeners from across the country. Her voice, a young woman standing in defiance of the toxicity that had plagued her family for so long, resonated deeply with people who had long since forgotten how to stand up for themselves. Back at Elaine's house, the front door opened just as the afternoon sun began to set. Elaine stepped outside, taking in the warmth of the day. Carolyn was standing there, a small smile on her face, holding a bouquet of flowers. "I think the whole town's heard about you now," Carolyn said with a teasing glint in her eyes. Elaine smiled back. "I never thought I'd see the day when my life would be on the front page of the Gazette." "Well, you did good," Carolyn said, handing her the flowers. "You're not just surviving anymore, you're thriving." Elaine took the bouquet, her fingers brushing the soft petals. "Maybe, but the hardest part is over now. The storm's passed." As Elaine turned to go back inside, a thought lingered in her mind. Tamara. Tamara hadn't yet commented on the article. It was only a matter of time before she would. But Elaine didn't care anymore. She wasn't the woman she had been. She wasn't bound by the shame or the silence. Tamara had crossed the line. Elaine had drawn it in stone, and now there was no erasing it. As the door closed behind her, she thought, if this is the end of one story, then it's the beginning of another. Elaine stood at the top of the steps of the Capitol, her breath steady despite the weight of the moment. The crowd gathered below was a sea of faces, each one eager for the next speaker, each one waiting for the words that had been promised. But this was her moment, a moment she had once thought impossible, where her voice would no longer be a whisper in her own home but a loud declaration, heard by those who needed to hear it most. She adjusted the microphone, her fingers brushing it as she felt the ripple of anticipation spread through the air. She glanced to her right, where Carolyn stood beside her, a steady presence as always. Her best friend, her anchor. "You've got this," Carolyn whispered, the words a quiet assurance. Elaine nodded, her gaze lifting to the crowd before her. It wasn't just the thousands in the square who were waiting for her to speak. It was the legacy of silence she had carried with her for so long. And now, it was time to lay it to rest. The crowd grew quiet as she stepped up to the podium. She could feel the eyes on her, the weight of their attention pressing in. But she was no longer the woman who had stayed silent, the woman who had let the years of manipulation and cruelty define her. This was her time to speak, and she would not waste it. Her hands clasped the sides of the podium as she took a deep breath and began. Her voice was strong, clear, and unyielding. "Dignity doesn't age," she began, her words slicing through the quiet air, "and neither does justice." The silence in the crowd was thick, as if they were holding their collective breath. Elaine paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but she didn't flinch. For the first time in years, there was no fear in her chest, only power. I have lived a life of silence, she continued, her voice growing firmer with each word. A life where I was told that silence was my duty, my obligation, my place. I was told that love meant submission. I was told that boundaries were barriers to love. She let out a small, steady breath before adding, "But I learned differently. Silence does not protect you. It does not serve you. It serves only those who want to control you." The crowd began to stir, a low murmur running through them, but Elaine didn't stop. Her story, her truth, was pouring out now, and it would not be stifled. I stand here today not because I want vengeance, but because I want something more: the truth. The truth about what happens when you give everything, and the world takes it. The truth about what happens when you finally decide that enough is enough. She paused again, her gaze sweeping over the faces in front of her. The crowd was no longer just listening. They were with her. She could feel it. Their energy. Their belief in her words. She spoke again, her voice unwavering. "The only thing standing between me and the rest of my life was a line," Elaine said. "I crossed it, and I'm here to tell you, there is power in crossing that line. There is power in standing up for yourself, for your dignity, for the truth. And once you've crossed it, you never go back." The crowd erupted into applause, but Elaine didn't flinch. She had learned to stand tall in her truth, and now she let it wash over her. She was no longer afraid. She was no longer hidden. Backstage, after the speech, Carolyn wrapped her arms around Elaine in a tight, wordless hug. The weight of everything had lifted from her shoulders, leaving only a quiet sense of accomplishment. "So," Carolyn said, her voice tinged with humor, "worth it?" Elaine smiled, a small, genuine smile that seemed to say everything. Every syllable. Gerald had been right there with her in spirit the entire time, but now, after the speech, he was waiting for her in his office. The office where it all began, the place where she had started her journey to reclaim what was rightfully hers. As she entered, he stood, a look of quiet pride on his face. "You've done more than speak," Gerald said, his voice rich with admiration. "You've shown the world who you are. You've made sure that no one will ever be able to erase your story again." Elaine smiled faintly. "Maybe, but we'll see. There's still work to be done." And then, with a final flourish, Gerald placed Elaine's photo on the wall of the firm, her smiling face, the first client to testify publicly in the firm's history. It was a small but significant symbol of her victory. Her courage would be remembered, not just by those in her life, but by the world. At home that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elaine's phone buzzed. She picked it up, her heart still racing from the day's events. It was a message from Mara. "I'm proud of you, Grandma." Mara's voice came through the speaker, strong and unwavering. "You didn't just speak for yourself, you spoke for us all." Elaine felt tears sting her eyes as she leaned back against the couch. Mara's words, their weight, their depth, echoed in her mind. The future had arrived, and it was standing beside her. But as Elaine settled into the quiet of her home, a single thought filled her mind, heavy with finality. Tamara, the woman who had tried to destroy everything she had. The woman who had raised her hand to silence her. The woman who, in the end, had given Elaine the strength to finally speak. Elaine closed her eyes, the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that was yet to come, settling deep into her bones. She grabbed my face and said, "Speak again, and I will slap you." So I spoke to my attorney, and now she's never allowed near me again. The door to the past had been shut. The future, however, was just beginning.